Commissioner John Harrington. Commissioner Harrington was appointed Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Public Safety by Governor Tim Walz in January of 2019. Prior to his appointment, he served as the Metro Transit Chief of Police, the St. Paul Chief of Police, and as a Minnesota State Senator. So he has certainly put in his time in public service. And so with that, please help me welcome Commissioner Harrington.
Thank you all, and good afternoon. Live from snowy St. Paul, where my very talented and very brave, too much ice, not enough runway or something to that effect, which is why I'm not with you even as we speak. It would have been my preference because I understood there was going to be a really nice lunch, and so I'm sitting in an office, I'm drinking cold coffee, definitely not having the lunch with you and getting to see you all live and in person, which after COVID has been the joy of the last couple of years, is to actually be with real people at some of these meetings. So I was asked to talk about public safety sort of in a very broad sense, and I've got a slide deck that I'm not going to, hopefully not kill you by PowerPoint, but I do have some information I think would be worthwhile to start a conversation, and hopefully if I don't drift back into elected official mode where my politician hat takes over my good sense, we will have time for questions at the end. So the first slide really speaks to two trend lines that we have seen, and they have smashed in the middle. And you know, the good news, I guess that there's good news, and there's not much good news that I typically tend to give people, is that we're not alone in this. Minnesota is not alone, Minneapolis is not alone, the Twin Cities is not alone. We have seen both the defund and police reform movement clash with large numbers of officers leaving the police service and leaving public safety in general. And so we have seen both this ongoing conversation, and it is going to be a conversation you're going to see in the next legislative session, where we're going to continue to, I think, try and understand what does police reform look like, and at the same time, how do we get more people into the profession? Because in fact, I would argue that we were not fully staffed even before George Floyd and before the riots, and that we need to seriously think about what does it mean, and what is the mission that we want for our police officers and our first responders. And I don't really think we've had that conversation in all candor. I've been a cop since 1977. And I can tell you that the class of 1977, Bob Fletcher and I are the last two of that St. Paul police class, spent about an hour and a half on dealing with people that have mental illness. We spent probably even less time than that with dealing with fentanyl or opioids. We spent even less time than that talking about domestic violence. And those are the things that police officers today are confronting each and every day. And we were neither trained, nor were our departments necessarily constructed to handle the kind of crises that we are being asked to confront every day. There was a time when I was in St. Paul, we actually charted that 50% of the calls for service the St. Paul Police Department responded to involved somebody that was in crisis. 50% of literally hundreds of thousands of calls every year were people in crisis, whether they were in crisis because of drugs, alcohol, and mental health issues. Think about that 50% and think about whether or not the police or the fire department or the social workers that were available at the time, which of them were probably the best vehicle for trying to bring some safe resolution, and safe for the individuals that were in crisis, safe for the officers and the first responders, and this is the part that I think oftentimes gets left out, safe for the community. I have lots of conversations with folks about, well, you know, the cops just didn't show up and do anything. You know, that it would have been better. And my answer to that is, most times it's not a cop voluntarily stopping somebody in crisis in the middle of the street or in a house that's breaking up the furniture. It's a family member or a neighbor or somebody else that's calling because they are deathly afraid that this person is going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. So I do think we have to think very seriously and very broadly about what is about community safety, what are we looking at in terms of the individual safety and their rights, And what do we also need to think about? If we're going to bring first responders into that situation, because many of them have said to me, I don't feel safe going into those situations anymore, and I am going to vote with my feet by saying I'm no longer going to work in that profession because it doesn't feel safe for me. I'm going to talk a little bit about crime, because I think that also has a nexus to this. In the last 2 years, since we lost a lot of cops, and since George Floyd, we have seen crime rates skyrocket in the state of Minnesota, and in New York, and in Oregon, and in Washington State, and in Iowa, and pretty much everywhere across the country we have seen post-riots, we saw the crime rates run up dramatically. And there's some good news here. Like I said, I didn't say there's much good news, but there is a little good news. The statewide, and this is one of the things that we have done in the last 3 years, is we have pushed to have the BCA get more current crime data. If you don't know what's going on, it's hard to respond. And I'm an old Bratton guy from the NYPD days of saying, if I know where the crimes are, I know where to put the cops. Well, I need to know where to put the resources and anything. And so if I don't have the data, I can't do that. And that's one of the things I've been encouraging public safety to do, is to get into the data revolution. Give us the data. Give the data to your officers. Share the data with your elected officials. Because I think when we're all well informed, we're all better off. The good news is that from last year, when we had a record number of murders, a record number of ag assaults, and record in almost every category, this year we're seeing those numbers down. So we are 752 as of a couple days ago in terms of our aggravated assaults. That's still a lot of aggravated assaults, and I'll tell you that aggravated assaults are primarily gun crimes. Our gun crimes are just not only historically high, although coming down, but the volume at the gun crime scenes is also historic. So when I'm talking to my chiefs in St. Paul, and Minneapolis, and even in the suburbs in greater Minnesota, what I'm hearing from them is about switches and sears. Modifications made on 3D printers oftentimes not to take a semi-automatic handgun or rifle and turn it into an automatic weapon. And what that looks like on the ag assault scene is that we're rolling up on crime scenes where there are 30 and 40 shell casings at the crime scene. I come from a revolver age where 1 or 2, you wouldn't have any shell casings. 1 or 2 rounds might fly. Now we're getting 30 and 40, and these are cases, so you start doing the math on how many rounds are going out of the gun and how many victims are we likely to have. So the ag assaults are going down. We are doing some really good work both at the county level, Minnesota Heals over in Harrington County. We are really hitting the ground hard there. The federal level, Andy Luber has done a great job of really taking our drug cases and our gun cases and really going after them with federal charges. And we've made a big point of that. We've been making that point to the gangsters and the criminals who are doing this, because we want them to be as afraid of what's going to happen if they continue to commit crimes. As ag assaults drop, we also have seen homicides drop, and so that is also good news there. The buffering that for me is that so many of our homicides this year, we've had a lot of kids, again, that have gotten shot, and a lot of our homicides are domestic violence homicides, and that's an area that has always been a passion of mine, and it is still an area that I think we as a state can do better with. We need to build housing for our victims. We need to be more proactive in our policing in terms of identifying those situations where we have highly value. I've been working with Praxis and SPIP and other groups for years now. It's not rocket science anymore. It's asking 5 or 6 or 7 questions at a crime scene and then going back and doing some really quick math about, has he choked you? Has he taken your phone away from you? Has he tried to keep you from talking to your family and friends? And when you have yeses to more than a few of those cases, you just start thinking about safety plans for your victims at that point. Sex offenses have also gone down. But again, that's the good news. The unpleasant part of this that I am seeing is that sex trafficking and attempts to, in fact, buy Minnesota girls, especially girls, very young girls, seems to be on the rise. And the human trafficking task forces that we're working with the BCA really hammered on this. We're making good arrests, but That trend line is disturbing to me that the market online largely for trying folks to prostitute women, and oftentimes not prostituting women, they're looking to prostitute girls and babies in that regard. And robberies are also down, and that's also good. That's partly driven by some really good work by aviation and others working on carjackings, and I'll get to carjackings here in just a second. Burglary is down, which is good. I think that's partly a function of the pandemic. Burglary was really down when everybody was at home. It went up initially when people started going back to work, and now it's going back down again. Motor vehicle theft is still up a little bit. And unfortunately, with the weather as it is right now, I unfortunately expect the next couple of months to see that pop again. We also saw issues around the catalytic converter theft. That is a federal case that the BCA and state have been involved with. It really literally was hundreds of millions of dollars in theft of catalytic converters that were going overseas. And we've also seen the modification of USB drives that allow folks to steal Hyundais and other modern cars. I'm talking about aggravated assaults being a concern, and you can see this sort of as we compare them. Minneapolis has been way up and down, but they're still really high. St. Paul Police, higher than normal, but not as high as Minneapolis. The 7 County metro area, sort of mirroring where St. Paul is, still high in peaks and valleys, but once again, pretty significantly lower than Minneapolis is. And then the good news for Greater Minnesota is that in Greater Minnesota, it has not been this high. We do see the gunplay, but we are not seeing it on as consistent a basis. So that is the good news for Greater Minnesota. The good news is in Minneapolis, the new commissioner of safety, Senator Alexander, and the chief really have taken a very affirmative plan to try and make sure that they're responding to drugs and violent crime in the city. So I'm actually optimistic that the work that we're seeing there is going to continue to push that kind of crime down. One of the areas that we are not seeing go down quite so much is larceny, so theft, and that's catalytic converters, but just theft from stores is also a big concern. And then the topic that got the most interest was carjackings. And again, if you look at this, what you see is that Minneapolis has still got the lion's share of the carjackings, although it's down significantly from where it was last year, but it's still much higher than almost any place else. Almost every place else you've seen carjackings return back to being the rarity that it was before. And frankly, up until fairly recently, carjackings weren't anything that we even tracked very often. The other crime trend that I do want to mention, because it does seem to link up with where we're seeing the aggravated assaults and where we are seeing is fentanyl. And we are seeing fentanyl come into the state from virtually every direction that you can come into the state. It's coming up from the southern border, it's coming from the north, it's coming from the east and the west. And it's coming in multiple forms, whether it's rainbow fentanyl, the new gray death, liquid fentanyl. We're seeing fentanyl come in just enormous quantities, and we're seeing it mixed in with TP and marijuana and a variety of other substances. And we're seeing the overdoses that are they're clearly the result of that. The good news is that the vast majority of the cases, the naloxone, the Narcan does work, and has created a lot of safes. And one of the conversations we're having with one of our tribal nations, in fact, is how do we make sure that Narcan is more readily available? And they were talking about, can they have it, it be in a dispensary, can be in a vending machine? Are there ways of us to be able to make sure that not only the first responders have it, but that community folks have it in those communities where we're seeing these overdoses go up and up and up? The state has leaned in on trying to respond to crime, and so, whether it is the BCA, Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which has opened 145 cases, just 6 cases next week. That has resulted in 530 arrests this year. So, and what we are doing is we are leaning in on the violent crime, on the sex offenses, on the murder cases, where departments either don't have the resources or because they're so understaffed, and that was being the case in point, where they simply don't have the detective horsepower that they used to have to be able to do that. One of the things that we're seeing as we're doing these investigations is we're seizing large numbers of firearms. 312 firearms that seized up till last week. 86,000 pills, 5 kilos of heroin, 1.5 kilos of cocaine, 7 pounds of meth. The work that the BCA is doing is dangerous work, and it's important work. And part of what you may note is that we've had to move the bodies around to be able to keep doing the work. So you may not have a full staff in every regional office right now, because in order to staff where the bulk of the cases are, we've been moving people there, and we've been moving undercover operations around to try and make sure that we can continue to do this work. In addition to the BCA, it's a new issue, but it's been one that we've taken on, which is the State Patrol has been working on street racing. And street racing, for those that don't have this interesting hobby in your backyard, are groups of anywhere from 20 to 100 people driving into a neighborhood and then basically doing the Fast and the Furious on your city streets. Part of why this came to our attention was that we had multiple homicides at street racing events as people bumped each other's cars, got in each other's way, disrespected each other. And so that became one of the early signs that we need to do more with this. And then because it was so obviously a traffic-related issue, we asked Colonel Langley of the State Patrol to lean into this, and they have just leaned in over 2,000 cars stopped. That's a lot of traffic stops. And these are very targeted stops because they are stops directly related, 861 of them for speed. We made 60 DUI arrests. And we are getting guns out of a lot of the cars. So it is both a traffic hazard, but it is also a public safety hazard that State Patrol and BCA, our aviation unit has been actively involved, the intelligence unit has been actively involved, all of those units all working together to try and reduce this. Project 2020 was just simply, we saw 500 fatals the year before, which was rising to a level we hadn't seen in decades. And so working on how do we slow people down, how do we stop the major hazards that were killing Minnesotans on the highway. It is notable to me that while the newspapers will report the 200 people that died in murders, we didn't get nearly as much notice on the 500 Minnesotans that died in motor vehicle crashes, 2.5 times. So I do think, the traffic enforcement piece and traffic safety is absolutely an essential part of what we all need to be doing. And we need to do that through TZD, and that is a combination of your public works folks working together with us on engineering, public health talking about it, and public safety talking about the enforcement, and education talking about how do we educate people to not make these kind of decisions. So we really do think we're having an effect. The numbers are down from where they were. They're not down as far as I would like, but I'm not sure that, what my traffic safety people always remind me is, for anybody's family, any one of these is a tragedy that you can never unsee. So that is another area that the state is working heavily on. And then heat, which is heavy enforcement activity in a targeted area, once again, 23,000 traffic stops around related to heat, trying to make sure that we can go to the places where there are problems and respond effectively. What I was asked to think about as part of this conversation was about staff shortages that we are all seeing. And as I said, this is not a Minnesota-only issue. Every time I talk to my counterparts in other states and in other cities, I'm hearing the same thing, that there are police shortages, especially in cities. But when I talk to my suburban and rural police chiefs, I hear that they're also, where they used to get 50 people that would apply for the one job, now then they only get 10 or less. And of that 10 or less, they're not necessarily the 10 that they want to necessarily hire. They're the 10 that have been taking the test a long time and keep coming back because they haven't gotten hired by somebody else, which is not an incentive to hire them in a world where you're going to hire. I used to make my running joke was my pension was based on my ability to pick 21-year-olds that I gave a gun and a set of car keys to. That's what you're doing as elected officials, as county and city managers. When we put cops out on the streets, we're hiring young people who are out there to do really tough work, to make very critical decisions in an environment today where there isn't much of a benefit of the doubt. And so that is definitely an issue. But I also want to make sure you know that we are short of firefighters. And as I've gone, we've been doing a lot of work with the fire services all over the state of Minnesota. Volunteer fire services are really struggling to keep young people in their towns continuing to volunteer. And that has a side effect that a lot of folks I don't think about. So one of my jobs is I do line of duty deaths. So anybody that is in first responder that dies in the line of duty, their file comes across my desk. And what I've seen over the last couple of years are 60-year-old firefighters who had gone to a fire, and they'd gone home and had a heart attack. And firefighting is, well, I've never been a firefighter, but it sure looks like a young man's game as oftentimes it's not. Climbing ladders, pulling hose, putting on the turnout gear, running into bad, smoke and all that other stuff. Seems like something that if you had a bad heart, it would not be the ideal set of facts there. But when I talk to some of the old timers on the fire service, what they tell me is, we need 4 people for a truck to go out. If I retire from the fire service, we're short. And so I'm not willing to let my community not have a full fire crew that's available. But there's a cost for that, and I think we're paying that cost in deaths of some of our firefighters and some of our first responders who are staying in the business longer than might be healthy for them. And I think that's something we also have to look at. EMS is also struggling to get enough bodies in the door. And then one is also close to my heart because we run the 911 backbone. Telecommunicators, the TCs, the people that answer the 911, the dispatchers, they're also seeing staff shortages. So the entire array of first responders that cities, communities depend on are all struggling to get the right people in the door. While I am really focused on trying to get the numbers up, I'm also very aware that if you don't get the right people, we don't get the diversity of our communities in the door and in these first responder jobs, that it will be difficult for us to really meet the needs of the communities that we serve. My experience now, most of my experience is St. Paul, Metro Transit, and then more or less, I'd say I'm mostly an urban guy once. I wouldn't know my way around a farm field if you brought me out there and gave me a map. But it still strikes me that as I talk to chiefs and sheriffs across the state, talk to fire chiefs, they're struggling to get folks in the door. And I keep looking around and wondering, are they asking the right people to join them? Have they really thought through the challenges of how do you diversify your ranks at the same time you're trying to increase your rank? So I think that is definitely an area that I think we can do something about. I have had some success in doing that in a couple of my departments, and I'm happy to share that. I don't think we're going to have time to do that with our conversation today, but I will tell you that there are departments that are doing both. And one of the models of that I will throw out just for you for future study is a process that Booker Hodges and Dr. Matt Boston, both of them are actually PhDs, created, which was called the character-based hiring process. And they saw diversity, they saw sick time go down, they saw commendations for good work go up, and they saw complaints against officers and deputies go down during that, and they had less problems filling their ranks. Now this is before the Great Resignation and before COVID, so the model may or may not still be functioning. Well, I will note that Wilmington Police Department, run by Dr. Hodges, is at full staff. It's one of the few police departments I know that is at full staff, and they're at a 4-year crime low. That may say something that indicates that the character-based model that he operates out of is something that folks should continue to look at. One of the ways that I have used, and this is an area that I don't think we're doing as much with as we could, is looking at alternative tracks into public safety. When I came on in 1977, the St. Paul Police Department put an ad in the Star Tribune, or probably in the Pioneer Press, because they probably hated the Star Tribune because they were the hated paper being inside the river. But in any case, and that's all you needed. We got 2,000 people to apply for 50 jobs. The last time I talked to Chief Axtell, this is Axtell before Axel Henry came in, he had worked for a year with the Law Enforcement Career Path Academy, which you see on the screen, to recruit that body. And because he was able to do that, he had 65 positions open. He was able to fill 55 of them in one academy. But he had been grooming this group for about 3-4 years. He had brought them on as Career Path Academy students. They had done community service. They had been like CSOs. They had done community work. And then after years of preparation, having helped them get through school because he helped subsidize their education, they were now city employees, he was able to hire them as the next generation of St. Paul police officers. It's a model that works. It's not a cheap model because all those folks were on city payroll for 3 or 4 years before they actually put on a badge and a gun and actually got the job of being a cop. But in a world where we're struggling to get the bodies in the door, there's also some usefulness there just to think about what could those career path students do? Could they go out and help at accident scenes? Could they go out and help with crime scenes? Could they help you at training? Could they help you with many different jobs that don't require a licensed gun and the permission to use force? And the answer is yes. You can find really important work for them, and they add to the volume of responders in your cities. And so that is a model that I think people should look at. I am a big believer in police explorers. I used to recruit heavily from the police explorers post. When I talk to my fire chiefs, what they tell me is that they have been recruiting heavily from the fire explorer posts, and there are EMS explorer posts. And what we know is that there are literally thousands of young people that at age 16 to 18 are very interested in these jobs. And then there's a huge cliff where they drop off the map and they don't follow up once they're in college into the profession. I think we need to very seriously sit down with Boy Scouts of America, which usually is the sponsor agency for the Explorer group, and really seriously think through what is it that we are missing in keeping those young people in the business? How do we bridge that gap from 18 to 21 to get them to continue their interest in public safety service? And the last piece I'll note is that at the state level, Colonel Langer and the State Patrol has their own version of the law enforcement career path. It's not as extensive as St. Paul PD's was. It's called the Legal Academy, and it is still an academy. It starts months before the traditional academy starts at Camp Ripley, but it brings people in that does not have the post license, gives them time to get the post license, and then sends them to the academy. It has also been a vehicle for how we've been able to bring more women and more diversity into the State Patrol, which is definitely a goal that I've had. Still, I'd say in its infancy, but it is definitely a model that has worked, and it's not different than the POCOP programs that were used in years past. As we think about how do we bring folks into the business, how do we get them to come into the business, whether it is at police, fire, EMS, or telecommuting. I am fond of thinking about it through the SARA process, the idea of scanning, analysis, response, and assessment. I'm going to quickly jump over the next couple of slides just because I'm not going to have enough time to go through them in detail. But what I will encourage you to do is to think through If you think that increasing staffing in your police, fire, EMS, and 911 is a problem, then I would start at the beginning and start looking at an analysis of where are you losing your candidates, and are you in fact recruiting your candidates from the right place, and then you can build a response to that based on your own data. This is not a one-size-fits-all. What I did in St. Paul didn't work necessarily at transit. What I did at transit didn't necessarily work with the State Patrol or with the BCA. So you do have to tailor-make your response. But the first step in that is identifying it as a problem and then analyzing it to figure out where are the gaps. For me, my big takeaway has always been, who are the gatekeepers that keep me from getting to where I want to go? And in every organization, in every community, there are gatekeepers that are out there. And then finally, the last piece of this is to do the retrospective. Look at the people you hired, look at the classes you hired, look at your ability to hire, and then assess whether or not you're getting what you want. Because if you're not getting the quality, the character candidates that you want, then you may need to rethink about what your process is. And if you're not getting the numbers that you want, I think you need to rethink the process. So I'm going to jump to, because I know I'm running out of time, ideas and innovations that we at DPS are playing with and have proposed as ways of moving forward in the area of recruitment and retention, and then also just some general ideas in terms of public safety that you're going to see coming up. The first one, and this is one I pitched last year in January, and it died on the cutting room floor at the end of the legislative session, is that we needed a statewide first responder recruitment effort. The individual departments do what they can, but I really do think, and I've asked some of the big sports teams in Minnesota, I've asked the Vikings and some of the other big sports, I've asked them, well, how would you take this as a marketing group? You market a product. In some cases, it's been a product that hasn't always won. And yet you managed to fill, you put 70,000 people in the U.S. Bank Stadium. How do you do that? What is the marketing approaches that you take? And they have said they are willing to work with us, with their marketing and advertising people, to think about how do we start really having a message that encourages young people to look at first responder jobs as being the places that they want to be. I think that is definitely an area that we need to have. I think that needs to be a mission for the state. And then we need to have funds that will also improve local recruitment efforts for first responder professions. Part of what we pitched as the governor's proposal last year was giving money directly to communities with no strings attached, saying, you're going to know best how you need to spend this. You need to spend it on more cops, more firefighters, or more fire trucks, or more 911 equipment. When you do that, but we also think we need to provide some funds, because for our small departments, where they're trying to recruit on a regional basis, I think we just need to think through how do we fund some of those efforts. We are pitching the idea of signing bonuses and retention bonuses. We are seeing departments that have made that work, and some of those departments that are fully staffed are the ones that came up with signing bonuses from their city offices. And we've also seen departments that are now using retention bonuses to keep some of our veteran, the veterano cops on the job, who could retire and take their pension. But if you offered them just a little bit of an incentive, you may be able to keep them. And I think it's important for us to keep them, not just because of the number, not just because of the head count. Part of what I've seen happen is when you lose those officers, you lose the organizational memory, and you lose, in some cases, the culture of your organization as those veterans walk out the door. And so I think it's important for us to think about how we use signing bonuses and retention bonuses. We have picked the idea of a DPS reimbursement for college costs for peace officers. As I said, Minnesota is unique because in order to become a cop, you have to have a 2-year degree, you have to go through skills. And so if that's a financial issue that we cannot meet, then can we find ways to reimburse for that? And we've seen that done in COCOP and other places. We're looking at ECC certification. Once again, You know, the 911 operators, which are key and integral to everything fire, police, and EMS does, are one of the few parts of the public safety profession that doesn't have its own certification. An interesting piece that I picked up from my fire service folks was in some of the fire service departments, mostly volunteer and paid on call, the ones that are fully staffed are in communities where their businesses pay for their folks when they leave on a fire call or an EMS call. So Polaris, and I think one of the big window companies, I think it's Anderson or Marvin Windows, if you're working for them and you're a volunteer firefighter and you get called away from work, you don't have to take vacation or sick time or lose time at work. They simply compensate, and that has kept those fire departments at very close to full staff. And I think it's a conversation we should have with our corporate partners to say, in a state where so many of the firefighters are in fact, this may be something that we should ask our corporate partners to take responsibility to have as a policy for them. I've been heard from especially firefighters that we need to seriously think through the pension and pay for volunteers, which is oftentimes below minimum wage. I've literally sat with firefighters and said, I go to McDonald's, I would make more money than if I go on a fire call. And I'm only paid for the time that I'm actually on the fire call. I'm not paid for the training time, I'm not paid for my time practicing, I'm not paid for all that other stuff. I'd make better money simply working at the local McDonald's. And that can't be the choice that we're asking first responders to make. I mentioned Lido and Explore programs. I think we should be doing more to subsidize that. I think we need to encourage our high schools and tech colleges to add EMS classes so that we can start building a pool of talent for paramedics and first responders at an even earlier age. And it's simply a matter of adding those as additional credits, I think, for those high schools. And then I've actually heard from fire chiefs now that they're asking about one of the issues is they have folks that are 18 who are interested in the fire service, but we have a rule about how young you can be before you can actually go through burn tower training. And so looking at what the minimum age for firefighter training, I think, is an important additional piece of this. Last couple items, once again, we're pitching the idea of state funding for every city and county to use toward public safety needs. What I've recognized, and with Governor Wallace's rebate trips all over the state, is that we don't know your public safety needs nearly as well as you do. So it doesn't make any sense for us in St. Paul to set the agenda for what you should spend the money on. We think we should be able to buy the vehicle for giving the money to you to spend, and you make those decisions at the local level. We're also trying to find ways. Body-worn cameras have been part of what I have used to increase police accountability. And I think every officer in the state, and I think that right now we're at about 60% of the departments have body-worn cameras. So we think that would be an additional benefit so that when there's an officer involved shooting or when there's a death in custody, you're not looking at having to pay out millions of dollars because there's no information. We have found that body-worn cameras both improve performance and reduces, I believe, bad behavior on both community and policing side. First Responder Wellness Office, because there is a great deal of stress in the business right now. Best Reimbursement Program, we're looking at increasing the funding for that. We're hearing from firefighters and EMS that they now want bulletproof vests because of the kinds of calls that they're being sent to. And then we are working to continue to expand benefits, line of duty death benefits for cancer and PTSD. We're seeing suicide because we have not addressed the wellness issue by officers, by firefighters, and really do think we need to think through on the prevention end, how do we keep them from getting to that terrible, terrible place, and then when we do have that awful occurrence where we lose a firefighter to cancer, or we lose one to a heart attack, how do we make sure that their family is taken care of? And with that, I come to a close. As you may have seen in the paper, I am a short timer in this particular position, but these are the agenda items for the Department of Public Safety. They're not my personal agenda items, although I will continue to push for them well after I have left the state's employ. They are passions of mine to take care of our first responders, to get more of our first responders, and to be able to keep our communities safe. That's what I signed on for in '77 when I joined the St. Paul Police Department, and it's continued to be what has been my life's work. But I'm happy to answer any questions at this time, and will be open to questions even afterwards. So.